Hi, this is Matt Baker. Today I'm going to show you a timeline of the history of Gaza, starting from around 3500 BCE and going all the way up to October the 7th, 2023. I'm going to use the same format that we used in our videos, Who Controlled Jerusalem the Longest and Who Controlled Constantinople the Longest, both of which showed how each city changed hands over the years. When it comes to Gaza, this will hopefully help provide some context for better understanding the situation today. Let me begin by giving you the lay of the land. As you probably know, the city of Gaza is nowadays a part of the Gaza Strip, one of two main areas that are considered to be a part of Palestine, the other being the West Bank. Now, what a lot of people don't realize about the Gaza Strip is that it's really quite small. Here's what it looks like next to the borders of New York City. Within the Gaza Strip are four main urban areas. The largest is Gaza City in the north. However, towards the south, there is also Deir al-Balah, Khan Yunis, and Rafah. Separating Gaza City and these other three cities is a river called the Wadi Gaza. I point this out because this is where the earliest settlement near what is today called Gaza was located, all the way back in 3500 BCE. Archaeologists call it Tel Es Sakan, which means Hill of Ash, and it is with this settlement that we're going to start our timeline. Tel Es Sakan was built by the ancient Egyptians during the pre-dynastic period, so before the first pharaoh, and almost 1,000 years before the construction of the Great Pyramid. In other words, Gaza is really, really old. This early settlement had walls, so the assumption is that it was some sort of fort or outpost used by the ancient Egyptians in order to get resources in that area. But for some reason, the site was abandoned shortly after the unification of Egypt, so around 3000 BCE. Perhaps at this point, the Egyptians became more focused on Egypt itself. However, around 2600 BCE, the same site was resettled, this time by local Canaanites. Now, who were the Canaanites? I want to take some time to address this question because it's extremely relevant to the discussion around who the indigenous inhabitants of the land are today. Basically, the word Canaanite is used to describe the local population of the southern Levant prior to the emergence of the ancient Israelites. These people were distinct from the Egyptians, who lived to the southwest, as well as from the Assyrians and Babylonians, who lived to the north and east. However, we know that the Canaanite language was Semitic, and therefore we can assume that the Canaanites were more closely related to the Assyrians and Babylonians, whose languages were also Semitic. According to the Bible, the Canaanites were conquered and completely replaced by the Israelites after the Israelites escaped from Egypt, where they had been slaves. However, nowadays, most scholars understand the Exodus and conquest stories as being more of a myth or allegory, because according to the archaeological record, it appears that the Israelites were actually just a subset of Canaanites, whose culture became the dominant one after the Bronze Age collapse. So, to put it another way, Canaanite is the word we use to describe the people who lived in the area during the Bronze Age, and Israelite is the word we use to describe the people who lived there during the Iron Age. But they're the same people. Okay, so from around 2600 to 2300 BCE, which roughly parallels the Egyptian Old Kingdom, Tel Es Sakan was occupied by local Canaanites. But then after that, the site was abandoned, only to be rediscovered in 1998. And the sad thing is, archaeologists had only about 20 years to study it. That's because in 2017, Hamas decided to start bulldozing it for new development. And then on top of this, during the last 8 months, Israeli bombs have been showering the area. So it's yet to be seen if there's anything left. Now, at this point, I should mention that this was a difficult video to make. Especially near the end of the timeline, I'll be discussing things that, to put it lightly, are controversial and polarizing. This is why I yet again asked Ground News to specifically sponsor this video. That's because their app and website combines the world's news into one place, so that you can easily compare sources and verify information. Well, so thank you, Ground News. Now, back to the timeline. The next Canaanite settlement in Gaza was built nearby the first. It's now known as Tel al-Ajul and was established around 2000 BCE. So basically, this parallels the time of the Egyptian Middle Kingdom. It was at this site that the famous archaeologist Flinders Petrie found a massive hoard of Bronze Age gold jewelry, the largest such find in all of Palestine and Israel. Tel el-Ajul may also have been used by the Hyksos, the famous Semitic people who conquered Lower Egypt and ruled it as Dynasty 15. However, at the beginning of the Egyptian New Kingdom, when the Egyptians managed to expel the Hyksos, Tel el-Ajul was completely destroyed. It was likely not until the reign of the great pharaoh Thutmose III that the city was rebuilt, this time as an Egyptian city, serving for the next 300 years as the home of the Egyptian governor in charge of Canaan. It was sometime during this period that the city became known as Gazat, meaning the strong city. But then came the Bronze Age collapse, a massive, apocalyptic-like event that led to the fall of Egypt and a major change in the culture of Canaan. Arriving in Canaan around this time were the mysterious Sea Peoples, who probably came from somewhere near Greece. One group of these Sea Peoples eventually became known as the Philistines, and they built a powerful confederation of 5 cities, one of which was Gaza, the other 4 being Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. You may recognize the name Gath as being the hometown of the legendary giant named Goliath. Now, the Philistines are very important to the history of Gaza because it is from the word Philistine that the modern word Palestine comes from. However, keep in mind that the Philistines did not conquer all of Canaan. Around 1200 BCE, several of the surviving Canaanite tribes, together with some newcomers, reorganized themselves into a competing confederacy called Israel. If you want to learn more about the origins of ancient Israel and its 12 tribes from a secular rather than a biblical perspective, you can check out this earlier video we made on the topic, which I'll link to in the description. But for now, I want to point out that from approximately 1200 BCE to 600 BCE, Gaza was controlled by the Philistines, even though most of the rest of Canaan was controlled by the Israelites. So for example, in the Bible, we get several stories about an Israelite hero named Samson, who often fought against the Philistines. In fact, it was at Gaza that Samson died, after being betrayed by his lover Delilah. Then, of course, there's King David, who also had a lot of run-ins with the Philistines, including the time he defeated the giant Goliath during his childhood. Now, according to the Bible, the Philistines were eventually absorbed into the Kingdom of Israel. However, according to the archaeological record, they appear to have mostly maintained their independence, particularly at Gaza, which was their southernmost city. But then, around 600 BCE, the Philistines suddenly disappear from history, around the same time that the southern Israelite kingdom of Judah was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. So where did the Philistines go? Well, they were either completely destroyed at this point, or more likely, they were simply integrated into the general population of what was now the Babylonian province of Yehud. But the important thing to keep in mind is that there is no direct continuity between the ancient Philistines living in Gaza and the modern-day Palestinians living in Gaza. Although the two names are related, it's not as if the Philistines survived as a distinct group that is today known as the Palestinians, which is what some fundamentalist Christians seem to think. Unfortunately, I've seen some Christians quote scriptures like this one in Zephaniah, claiming that what is happening in Gaza today is the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. They do this because the verses mention that Gaza will be abandoned and that all those who live there will be destroyed. But take note that this passage also mentions 3 other Philistine cities, Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron. These cities are all now currently located within the borders of the modern state of Israel. So if you're going to claim that Gaza needs to be completely destroyed, you have to also claim that these 3 Israeli cities also need to be destroyed. But then, of course, there's also the fact that the prophecy was already fulfilled, shortly after the time that Zephaniah was writing. Like I said, around 600 BCE, the Babylonians destroyed the last remaining Israelite kingdom, which was called Judah, including their capital city, Jerusalem. Well, that destruction was part of a larger power struggle between Babylon and Egypt, and therefore it's almost certain that Gaza was destroyed at this point too. In fact, the archaeological record indicates that around 600 BCE, the population of the entire southern Levant decreased by about 90%. But as you might know, the Babylonian period was quickly followed by the Persian period, and it was during the Persian period that the entire region was rebuilt, including Gaza. Some prisoners of war, such as certain upper-class Judahites, returned to nearby Jerusalem, laying the foundation for what we now call Judaism. However, there were lots of other people in the area as well, including people who had survived the wars, and others who had been brought in by the Babylonians and Persians to resettle the land. So the thing I want to make clear is that the population of Gaza during classical antiquity was likely a mixture of a bunch of different people groups. You likely had some descendants of the Philistines who had originally come from Greece, but you also likely had Egyptians who had been living there off and on for around 3,000 years, as well as Bedouins from the Arabian Peninsula and former Canaanites, who were now known as Jews or Samaritans or simply the people of the land. And then on top of all of this, you likely had all sorts of newcomers. After all, the area we're talking about is at the crossroads of 3 continents. So my point is, we have to be careful of false equivalences when talking about the people from this area today. We cannot use the word indigenous for any people group from this area, either past or present, at least not in the same way that we use it when talking about Native Americans or Australian Aboriginals. The context is simply too different. Too many people have come and gone in this area, often mixing with each other, meaning that there is no longer any one group that can claim to be the undisputed first peoples of the land. But hold that thought for a moment, because for now, I want to continue with the timeline. The next major date I want to point out is 332 BCE, because at this point, Gaza was visited by one of the most famous people in all of world history, Alexander the Great. Gaza was the last stop on his way to Egypt, and in 332, he conquered the city, allowing him to then go on and conquer Egypt. At this point, Gaza was transformed into a Hellenistic city, meaning that it was modeled on Greek culture. After the death of Alexander and the subsequent infighting between his generals, it was first ruled by the Greek Ptolemaic dynasty, and then by the Greek Seleucid dynasty, before finally being ruled for the first time by an Arab dynasty as part of the Nabatean kingdom, which had its capital at Petra. The Nabateans built a new port near Gaza called Mayuma, and it became an integral part of the spice trade, transferring goods off the backs of camels and onto ships, bound for places like Greece and Rome. It was around this time that the nearby city of Jerusalem became the capital of a newly independent Jewish kingdom run by the Hasmonean dynasty, who were the descendants of the Maccabees from the Hanukkah story. Well, in 96 BCE, the Hasmonean king, Alexander Jannaeus, laid siege to Gaza, destroying most of the city and taking control of its port. Take note that the next 33 years was the only time until after the creation of the State of Israel that Gaza was controlled by an independent Jewish power, although the city lay in ruins for most of those 33 years. It wasn't until 63 BCE that Gaza was rebuilt, this time by the Romans, who had just taken control of the area under the general Pompey Magnus. A few decades after this, in 37 BCE, the Romans replaced the now puppet Hasmoneans with Herod the Great, and thus Gaza became part of Herod's kingdom. But that only lasted until 4 BCE, which is when Herod's kingdom became a tetrarchy, being split into 4 parts. However, take note that Gaza was not given to any of the 4 tetrarchs. Instead, it was assigned to the Roman province of Syria, even though it was not actually connected to Syria. However, even though it was not part of nearby Judea, it was greatly affected by the politics there. In 66 CE, when the Jews revolted against the Romans, Gaza was caught in the middle and destroyed in the process, just like Jerusalem a few years later. Then in 135 CE, when the Jews revolted again, the Romans decided to merge the province of Judea with the province of Syria. But instead of calling the new province Syria Judea, they instead called it Syria Palestina, Palestina being Latin for land of the Philistines. You see, the Jews had been totally defeated by this point, so this was a way for the Romans to further punish the Jews by naming the land after their old enemies, the Philistines, even though they no longer existed. It was thus from the year 135 BCE onwards that the land Gaza was sitting on, as well as the land around it, became known as Palestine. So who lived in Gaza at this point? Well, kind of like the last 700 years, it was a mixed bag. You likely had Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, descendants of the Philistines, descendants of the Canaanites, lots of newcomers. But most of all, you likely had people who, due to intermarrying, were a mixture of all of these groups. Overall, though, Gaza was definitely a Roman city by this point, with most of the people now worshiping Roman gods. This was actually true for most of what had previously been Judea. In fact, Jerusalem was rebuilt at this point as the pagan city of Aelia Capitolina. And as for any surviving Jews, well, instead of being concentrated in Judea, they were now dispersed all over the Roman Empire. Some remained in the Middle East and became Mizrahi Jews. Others moved to Spain, where they became Sephardi Jews. And then finally, some ended up in Germany, where they became Ashkenazi Jews. Take note that this last group initially intermarried with Italians, and therefore today their DNA is approximately 60% Middle Eastern and 40% European. Let's now continue with the timeline of Gaza. The next big change occurred during the 300s CE, which was when Christianity started to replace paganism as the main religion of the Roman Empire. Initially, most of the Christians lived at the port of Mayuma, whereas Gaza proper was still mostly pagan. But then in 395, a man named Porphyrius, now known as Saint Porphyrius, was made the bishop of Gaza, and he helped destroy all of the pagan temples there, laying the groundwork for Gaza to become a Christian city, being that Christianity was now the state religion of Rome. A few years after his death, the burial place of Porphyrius became the site of the first church in Gaza, which today exists as the Greek Orthodox Church of St. Porphyrius. Although, take note that the current structure dates to the Crusader period, not the 400s. Sadly, this church was hit by Israeli bombs in October of 2023, killing 18 people taking refuge there and damaging the historic structure. During the Christian period, Gaza also became, for the very first time, a place where Jews frequently visited and sometimes even lived. You see, ever since 135 CE, Jews had been prohibited from entering Jerusalem. So, for Jewish pilgrims wanting to visit the land of their ancestors, Gaza was the next best thing. There was even a synagogue built around 500 CE that had a beautiful mosaic floor done in Byzantine style, the most famous part being this depiction of King David playing a lyre. But then in the year 634 CE came what's likely the most important event in the history of Gaza. 634 was just 2 years after the death of Muhammad, and it was the year that Muslim armies met Roman armies for the very first time at the Battle of Ajnadain, about halfway between Jerusalem and Gaza. The Muslims won that battle decisively and then turned their attention towards Gaza, which they besieged for the next 3 years. In 637 CE, they were finally successful in capturing the city, but instead of destroying it, they occupied it peacefully, only killing enemy soldiers, not civilians. For the next 462 years, Gaza belonged to the district of Jund Philistin, which was now a part of the Arab Empire. During this time, most of its churches were turned into mosques, and most of its inhabitants gradually converted to Islam. A good example of holy sites being rebuilt is the Great Mosque of Gaza, which had originally been a church, and then before that had been a pagan temple, dedicated to the Philistine god Dagon. Even as a mosque, it's been rebuilt many times due to earthquake damage and several wars, including the current one, because once again, Israeli bombs have hit and damaged this incredibly important heritage site. The next big change in the area occurred in the year 1099, which is when Crusaders managed to capture Jerusalem and set up a small kingdom in Palestine, modeled on the ones found in medieval Europe at the time. At this point, most of the inhabitants of Gaza moved to either Egypt or Arabia, and thus the very next year, in 1100, the Crusaders were able to march in and take Gaza as well. You may have heard of a group called the Knights Templar. Well, they were actually given control of Gaza at this point, which they then ruled for the next 87 years, before handing it back over to the Muslim ruler Saladin, who had just recaptured Jerusalem. From there, Saladin's dynasty, the Ayyubids, ruled Gaza until 1260, which is when the city was yet again destroyed by yet another foreign invader, this time from farther away than ever before. Crazy as it may seem, in 1270, Gaza was destroyed by the Mongols, the same Mongols who also reached as far away as Japan. In Gaza's case, it was Genghis Khan's grandson, Hulagu Khan, who led the invasion. But soon after he captured Gaza, Hulagu Khan received word that his brother, the emperor, had died. He therefore had to leave Gaza and return home, which allowed the nearby Mamluks, an Islamic dynasty based in Egypt, to take control of Gaza. The Mamluks ruled the city until 1516, which is when Gaza became a part of the newly formed Ottoman Empire, which was ruled by a Turkish dynasty. Early on during this period, Gaza was administered by a family of governors known as the Ridwan dynasty. Under their guidance, Gaza experienced a golden age, and it became larger and more important than nearby Jerusalem. If you want to learn more about Islamic Gaza, I highly recommend you watch this video by my good friend Al-Mukarrama. I'll leave a link to it in the description. For now, the next date I want to point out is 1799, which was when yet another one of the most famous conquerors in all of world history managed to capture Gaza. Up to this point, Gaza had been captured by the likes of Thutmose III, Nebuchadnezzar II, Alexander the Great, Pompey Magnus, and Saladin. So I guess it's no surprise that we can also add to the list Napoleon Bonaparte. The French, however, stayed less than a year, and after they left, the city reverted back to Ottoman control. However, by this point, the Ottoman Empire was much weaker, and thus it was during the 19th century that the politics of Gaza and of Palestine in general started to become influenced by Western powers. It began with the rise of an Ottoman general named Muhammad Ali, who was originally from Albania, but who managed to become the governor of Egypt after the French left. Ali helped modernize Egypt and make it powerful again, becoming the de facto independent ruler there, even though technically Egypt was still Ottoman territory. But he wasn't happy with ruling just Egypt. So in 1832, he conquered Gaza and most of Palestine as well. From there, he went on to take Syria, and all of a sudden, it seemed very likely that he could defeat the Ottomans altogether and become the new sultan. This made the British nervous because they were allied with the Ottomans and wanted to maintain the status quo. So basically, in 1840, they, along with Germany, Austria, and Russia, intervened and forced Muhammad Ali to back off and limit his rule to Egypt only. This meant that Gaza was back in Ottoman hands. But like I say, Ottoman power was very weak by this point, and therefore it was sometime during the late 1800s and early 1900s that the first seeds of Palestinian nationalism were born. Up to this point, there had never been an independent state called Palestine, and no one from Gaza or anywhere else nearby had ever considered themselves to be a Palestinian. In fact, by this point, the region had been ruled by various colonial powers for about 2,500 years. But sometime during the late 1800s and early 1900s, Gazans stopped thinking of themselves as Ottomans, and instead they thought of themselves as Palestinians. But once again, I'd like to point out that the occupants of Palestine at this point were, like they had been for thousands of years, a real mixed bag. Although most were Muslim Arabs by this point, there were also Christian Arabs, as well as some pre-Zionist Jews. So initially at least, the term Palestinian was used as more of an umbrella term for anyone who lived in the region, regardless of religion or ethnicity. Plus, remember, the people living there were the descendants not of any single group, but rather of many different groups. After all, armies had been marching back and forth over this piece of land for centuries. Okay, let me now zoom ahead to World War I. By then, Great Britain was in control of Egypt, with a descendant of Muhammad Ali having been given the title of Sultan. And the Ottomans were now the enemies of Britain. So during World War I, the British ended up having to fight the Ottomans in an effort to take control of Gaza. They tried and failed in March and April of 1917, but then were finally successful in capturing the city in November. Helping them were the armies of an Arab leader named Hussein bin Ali from Mecca. You see, the British had managed to convince him to launch an all-out Arab revolt against the Ottomans, based on the promise that if the British won the war, they would help create an Arab megastate and put Hussein in charge of it. Well, guess what? That never happened. I mean, the British did win the war, but they didn't follow through on their promise to help create an Arab megastate. That's because they had made two other conflicting promises. First, they made an agreement with France to divide the area into parts. Basically, France would oversee Syria and Lebanon, and Britain would oversee Palestine and Iraq. As for Arabia, they would let the Saudi dynasty take over that. Second, they also promised several Zionist organizations that they would help create a Jewish homeland in Palestine. So here's what happened. In 1920, Mandatory Palestine was created. It was originally supposed to include the area east of the Jordan River, but in the end, that part was made into a separate country called Transjordan, later just Jordan. One of the sons of Hussein bin Ali was made its first monarch, and to this day, one of his descendants is still on the throne. But Mandatory Palestine, including the city of Gaza, was kept separate. So from 1920 to 1948, it was governed directly by the British. Now at this point, I need to explain the Zionist movement. For centuries before the Holocaust, Jews had been on the receiving end of heavy persecution in Europe. While many Sephardic Jews ended up back in the Middle East during the Ottoman period, most Ashkenazi Jews had been pushed into Eastern Europe, where the persecution was getting increasingly worse. Thus, during the 1800s, many Jews started to promote the idea of having their own state. Besides Palestine, many other locations were initially proposed, but in the end, Palestine became their main focus. After all, that was where the Jews had originally lived in ancient times. By the time the British took control of Palestine, Zionists had already been buying land there for around 40 years, going back to 1881. However, during the mandatory period, the British continued to sell even more land to the Zionists, so that by 1945, the demographics had changed considerably, and the land distribution now looked like this, with blue representing the areas where the Zionist newcomers lived, and green representing the areas where Arabs lived. Now, as to whether what happened between 1920 and 1945 was fair or unfair, I'll leave that up to you to decide. On the one hand, you have to remember that the British were a colonial power, and therefore they didn't really have the right to give away any land, especially considering that there were already people living there. However, on the other hand, you might also want to consider that the Jewish newcomers were fleeing heavy persecution in Europe and didn't really have anywhere else to go, particularly after 1924, which is when Jewish immigration to the U.S. basically ground to a halt. What happened next made the situation even worse. Tensions between Palestinians and Jews were already high, with Palestinian Arabs demanding independence, using this flag, which was very similar to the flag used for the previous Arab revolt back during World War I. But then World War II ended, and it was revealed that 6 million European Jews, representing 2/3 of their population, had been murdered in the world's worst ever genocide. But even so, most Western countries were still reluctant to take any Jewish refugees. Thus, the need for Jews to have their own state, where they could be safe, was at an all-time high. The newly formed United Nations suggested this plan, creating 2 new countries, one for Arabs and one for Zionists. But it never happened. Instead, the 2 sides went to war, with the Zionists winning and declaring the new state of Israel, and the Palestinian Arabs experiencing the Nakba, meaning catastrophe, in which approximately 750,000 Palestinians were forced out of their homes. In response, around the same number of Jews were forced out of their homes in nearby Arab countries. These Jewish refugees were welcomed by Israel, but the Palestinian refugees were not welcomed by the neighboring Arab countries. Thus, it was now the Palestinians who had no place to go. The only territories they had left were the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. In 1949, when the dust finally settled, Gaza was left in control of Egypt, and the West Bank was left in control of Jordan. This situation remained in place until 1967, which is when a 6-day war broke out between Egypt, Jordan, and Syria on one side, and Israel on the other. Israel won that war decisively and ended up in control of not only the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, but also the entire Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights. The Sinai was given back to Egypt in 1982, but Gaza and the West Bank remained in Israeli hands. Therefore, in 1987, the first Palestinian Intifada, meaning uprising, broke out, ending in 1993 with the creation of the Palestinian Authority, which was given partial control over both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Yasser Arafat became the Palestinian Authority's first leader, and Gaza was named as its capital. But like I say, the new government was only given partial control because the Israeli military remained in the Palestinian territories. And even worse, illegal Israeli settlements were created in them as well. Thus, there was a second intifada between 2000 and 2005. This time, Israel agreed to leave Gaza altogether. But around the same time, the Palestinian leader, Yasser Arafat, died, creating a split within Palestinian politics that exists to this day. On one side is Arafat's former party, which has softened its initial position and now simply wants to have an independent Palestinian state existing side by side with Israel. On the other side is the more extreme Hamas group, which still advocates for the complete destruction of Israel. Complicating the matter is the fact that in recent decades, the Israeli government has become more and more right-wing and expansionist. In 2007, Hamas took control of the Gaza Strip, and the more moderate Palestinian Authority was left with only the West Bank. Then came October the 7th, 2023, which is where I'm going to end the timeline, because it's yet to be seen what will happen next. However, I will leave you with a few final comments, which are entirely my own opinion. What Hamas did on October the 7th was wrong and immoral. And what Israel's military is doing in response is also wrong and immoral. The IDF has been far too indiscriminate, with at least 20,000 women, children, and seniors being killed, a record 329 journalists and aid workers being killed, and millions of other innocent civilians being left to starve. Not to mention the fact that the Palestinians have been living as second-class citizens for decades. So the bottom line is something needs to change. In my view, Israel must continue to exist as a safe haven for Jews. However, the Palestinian people also deserve a state where they can live in peace and have the same opportunities and freedoms as their neighbors. They've been denied these things for far too long, and therefore the West, who remember helped create this whole mess in the first place, needs to do whatever it can do to help make this happen, instead of just making money off the sale of weapons. This is why, as a Jew, I support the current protests, while at the same time hoping for the safe return of the hostages. But regardless of where you sit on these issues, I hope this video has given you some insight into the very long history of Gaza. Thanks for watching.